Okay.
The human rights crisis in the Sri Lankan North and East. I'm Brian Senewiratne. I'm speaking from Brisbane, Australia. I will speak for 1 hour and then leave 15 minutes for questions and answers. What exists in the Sri Lankan North and East is a military/police state. The North and the East are not under the Sri Lankan government, but under the Sri Lankan military and police. It is a military/police dictatorship where the military and police can do what they want with no accountability. This has now gone on for more than 10 years and will go on for the foreseeable future if there is no international pressure on the Sri Lankan government. This pressure will have to be generated by those outside Sri Lanka. It may even be a violation of the Sri Lankan constitution since there is no provision for setting up of a military/police state in a part of the island. This will have to be challenged by constitutional experts outside Sri Lanka. If the situation that the Sri Lankan government it is a situation that the Sri Lankan government can correct with the stroke of a pen. The pressure to do this will have to come from outside Sri Lanka. The size of the military in the North and the East. There is a massive military presence in the North and the East. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the military balance, the Sri Lankan military has 255,000 active members. This is larger than Saudi Arabia, which has 227,000, France 204,000, Israel 170,000, UK 147. This miserably poor country with no external enemies has 255,000 active members. It is an outrage. The ratio of soldiers to civilians in the North and the East is 1:5. In Mavonia, it is 1:3. Pearl, that's a Tamil group in Washington, and Adayalam Center for Policy Research, a similar group in Jaffna, in a paper titled Normalizing the Abnormal Militarization of Mullaitivu, say that the ratio of military to civilians in Mullaitivu is 1:2. There is no place in the world that is so highly militarized. The military and police are responsible for all the serious violations of human rights of the Tamil people in the area. International intervention is mandatory for humanitarian reasons. If nothing is done, the Tamil people in the area will simply wither away since it has no means of survival, no land to cultivate, no sea to fish, no jobs, and unable to set up businesses since all of these have been taken over by the armed forces. The Tamil tigers have been crushed. The question is the justification for such a massive military. Who is the enemy? Since there is no justification, the military will have to be withdrawn and the police recruited from the local Tamil population. This is imperative and urgent. It will not happen without international pressure. The military getting involved in non-military activity. The armed forces have gone into non-military commercial activity. They are engaged in large-scale property development, construction projects, business ventures such as travel agencies, holiday resorts, restaurants, and numerous cafes in the North and the East. The military has no place in business activities. This non-military activity is having a serious impact on civilian life and must be stopped. This will not happen without international pressure on the Sri Lankan government. Military intervention in local civilian economy. The military intervention is operating its own businesses, employing civilians in military and civil society projects, and getting into private sector investments. I'll deal with just a couple of these. The military-operated businesses. Since the end of the armed conflict in May 2009, the military has its own commercial activities. They range from agriculture and animal husbandry to tourism and to commerce. Agriculture and animal husbandry. Of the 13 farms operated by the military, 6 are in the North and the East. These farms grow paddy, corn, vegetables, fruit, coconuts, sugarcane, peanuts, oranges, areca nut, cinnamon, banana, jack, and seasonal crops. They produce dairy produce, poultry, and cattle. The product is sold well below market price, making it impossible for the local farmers to compete. Tourism and war museums. In Mullaitivu alone, the military run at least 5 hotels and restaurants. Two were opened in 2012, a mere 3 years after the end of the armed conflict, in an area where hundreds of Tamils are still looking for their loved ones. Two resorts are located in the Nansikadal area, which provides visitors with a war tourism experience directed by the military and from their perspective. All the monuments and museums carry signs stating that the armed conflict was a humanitarian rescue operation by the military to save the Tamils from the LTTE. There is no mention of the tens of thousands of Tamil civilian casualties. The military getting into education and schools. Of serious concern is the military getting into education to teach military-designed curricula. There is also concern that the military is appointing teachers with higher salaries to teach these curricula. These military activities do not have the training to get into these areas, and children who are at the receiving end of this might suffer. I have seen this in medicine when I was a don in the Perdana University in Sri Lanka. New recruits trained in medicine and who were competent in treating patients were suddenly appointed as medical teachers. They had no experience in teaching, which is entirely different to treating patients. There were several complaints from medical students, so that I decided to attend some of these lectures. They were dreadful. I had to redo most of them, sent and insist that lecturers in medicine, in addition to knowledge in medical knowledge, had to be trained in teaching. The absolute need to have human rights monitors in the Tamil areas. Where there is a violation of human rights such as rape by the armed forces, police and paramilitary groups working with the government, there is nowhere that the victim, a Tamil woman or girl, can lodge a complaint. To go to the police is not only useless, but it might be dangerous. In my book on sexual violence, which I will detail at the end of this talk, I have said that if the victim goes to a police station or an army camp, there is a risk that the victim or whoever accompanies her getting raped or details taken for a midnight visit by the armed forces or police. The claim that international human rights groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and International Crisis Group are allowed into the country is not good enough. If when these organizations visit the Tamil areas, they are accompanied by members of the armed forces or police, notes are taken as to who was visited and what was said. This even happened when the former UN Human Rights High Commissioner Navanitha Pillai visited the area. Before her visit, people were told that any complaints to her would be noted and the consequences would be serious. There is no alternative to setting up of manned Tamil civilians to whom victims of human rights abuse can complain without fear. It will take years before this serious complaint is resolved. It will not be resolved until the armed forces are resolved from the area and the Sinhalese police are replaced by Tamil police. The UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights speaks. On the 27th of January 2012, a couple of weeks ago, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, issued a damning report on Sri Lanka's human rights situation, urging the international community to take strong actions to prevent another human rights tragedy unfolding in Sri Lanka, including targeted sanctions and punitive actions against perpetrators. The report contains a devastating and unprecedented critique of the handling of human rights in Sri Lanka, and its recommendations have escalated the possibility of intervention by the Council beyond anything that has been suggested to date. The logic of this escalation is based on the High Commissioner's conviction of an accelerated deterioration in civic, political, minority, religious and other democratic rights under the present administration, which she explicitly states needs the UN Human Rights Council's urgent action. For the first time ever, she called on member states of the Human Rights Council to pursue referral of Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the body established by the Rome Statute in 1998, to try perpetrators of war crimes, genocide, and violations of international human rights law. In a warning to Sri Lankans accused of war crimes and human rights violations, the High Commissioner urged member states to strongly consider targeted sanctions against such individuals, including travel bans and a freeze on assets. This is what she said. Given the demonstrated inability and unwillingness of the government to advance accountability at the national level, it is time for international actions to ensure justice for international crimes. States should also pursue investigations and prosecutions in their courts under accepted principles of extrajudicial or universal justice of international crimes committed by all parties in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lanka's contribution to the UN peacekeeping operations must be kept under review. The High Commissioner also urged the Council to support a dedicated capacity to collect and preserve evidence for future accountability processes. What now happens? Remember that the Human Rights Council has some 47 members who have to act. They can decide to do something, or they can decide, irrespective of what the High Commissioner says, to do nothing. Human Rights Watch has already referred to this, and I will refer to that in a minute. What can you do? For a start, you can write to the High Commissioner. Google will tell you the address, and you can thank her for what she has done. You can check whether the country you live in is represented on the council, and if so, contact the representative and say that you are concerned. You must act. To do nothing is not an option. Human Rights Watch endorsed the recommendations of the High Commissioner for targeted sanctions on Sri Lankan officials credibly accused of war crimes and the establishment of an independent international mechanism to investigate violations of international law. In a 93-page report, Human Rights Watch warned that the UN will lose credibility if it fails to adopt tough resolutions at the 46th UN Human Rights Council session this March. Human rights has acted, you must act too. Crimes beyond belief. PISC, which is independent, non-profit law and policy organization based in Sydney, Australia, funded by the New South Wales Public Purpose Fund and Commonwealth State Legal Services. PISC, in its International Crimes Evidence Project, ICEP, published a major 235-page report titled Sri Lanka, Island of Impunity, Investigation into International Crimes. It is one of the most damning indictments on what is going on, and is still going on in Sri Lanka. One witness whose statements were taken by the ICEP was told by a senior security force officer that he had personally participated with his officers in the gang rape of a female LTTE who had surrendered. The security officer described to the witnesses that they had raped each woman. They killed them by tying one of their legs to a tree and the other to a tractor, which was then driven away from the tree, causing the woman's body to be torn apart. Desmond Tutu said, the sheer viciousness and brutality of the sexual violence is staggering, as is the racial verbal abuse by the torturers and rapists in the Sri Lankan forces. Turning to Sinhalization, there has been a mass relocation of Sinhalese from the south to the Tamil areas by the government. What is not widely known is that the Sinhalese military and police who have quit their jobs are being relocated in the north with their families. The result is a massive increase in the number of Sinhalese in the north and the east. If this continues, the north and the east will be dominated by Sinhalese. It will not be reversible, as we have seen in Ampare in the east, which was a Tamil area that has been Sinhalized. The long-term objective of accelerated Sinhalization of the Tamil area is to destroy the Tamil homelands and establish a mono-ethnic identity throughout the island as single Buddhist nation. Turning to Buddhistization, Buddhist temples and structures are proliferating in the area where there are no Buddhist civilians. The only Buddhists are members of the armed forces and police. What happens is that a bo tree is planted in an area which is then declared a Buddhist sacred site. A Buddhist temple is then erected. The British Tamils Forum has published an excellent book, which I would strongly recommend to you, Proliferating Buddhist Structures in the Tamil Homelands, Sowing the Seeds of Disharmony. You can get this for free from the British Tamil Forum. Education in Jaffna is in chaos. Dr. Da Somasundram, Professor of Psychiatry in Jaffna, delivered an important lecture, A Lost Generation of Tamil Youth. What he said was alarming. 70% of students fail the grade 5 examination annually, and 50% fail the O-level. Of those who sat for the advanced level, only 15% enter universities. Even the few who enter universities are not assured of a bright future. The university system, which was doing reasonably well up to the early 1980s, has deteriorated markedly due to the general chaos of war, poor resources, poor support from the state, and the loss of able academics and teachers with the general brain drain. This must-read publication is on the net. The difficulty in getting into university is compounded by the fact that large numbers of Sinhalese from the south are getting into the Jaffna University. Some of them qualify for university education, others get in because they know the right people. As someone who has been a senior lecturer in medicine in the Peradeniya University in Sri Lanka, in the late 1960s, I am well aware that a significant number of medical students were Tamils from Jaffna. There is no place that I know of in any part of the world that has produced more professionals than Jaffna. As such, what is going on in Jaffna is an absolute disaster. Jaffna will take decades, if ever, to get back to where it was on the top of the educational league table. Of equal concern is parents who can afford to send their sending their children abroad. Once trained, they are not going to return. A serious brain drain will adverse not only Jaffna but also the rest of the country. Getting on to poverty and unemployment in the north. Poverty and unemployment are higher in the northern province than anywhere else in Sri Lanka. At the Northern Province Council, Northern Province second budget reading, the Chief Minister said that out of the 25 districts in Sri Lanka, Kilnochi was the poorest. Mullaitivu, which was previously the poorest, is now number 2 on the list of poverty by district. Jaffna is the 5th poorest. The level of unemployment is also higher in the northern province than in any other province. Turning to sexual violence in the north and east, sexual violence has increased across the northern province. Women widows in their 20s are sexually assaulted at work. Women teachers are sexually assaulted in schools. Unwanted pregnancies and teenage pregnancies are an issue. Many men come to Jaffna from other places, have relationships with women, marry them and then leave them. Society shuns these women, seeing that they are indecent. Sex is a taboo subject in Tamil culture, as sex education is not taught or totally taught. In what is still a male-dominated society, such issues are difficult to deal with. In my book on sexual violence, the details of which I will give you at the end of this talk, of the 170 pages, it has nearly doubled in 4 years since it was first published in 2015. The next edition in March 2014 was 264 pages. That's gone up from 170 to 264 in 4 years. Continuing violation of human rights. There continues to be involuntary disappearances, abduction, arrest without warrant, illegal detention at unknown sites, and a failure to release those who have been held without charge or trial. In 2017-18, Amnesty International annual report spells it out. I'm not going to read it because you can Google Amnesty International annual report and read it for yourself. Turning to the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the PTA has been condemned by every human rights group in the world. It has been used for the extensive violation of human rights and for numerous illegal arrests, detention without charge or trial, disappearances, sexual violence, torture, and much more. The Sri Lankan government was committed in the UN Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1 in October 2015 to repeal the PTA and replace it with anti-terrorism legislation in line with contemporary international best practice. A counter-terrorism act was drafted by the Sri Lankan government. Rather than reining in the PTA's definition of terror, the CTA expanded upon it, criminalizing any activity which threatens the unity of Sri Lanka. This includes gathering information to supply to a third party deemed by the Sri Lankan government as a threat to Sri Lanka's unity. The potential for local activists collecting information about human rights abuses, being accused and charged with terrorism is very real. In 2019, the Sri Lankan cabinet approved the CTA. This was slammed by the Sri Lankan civil society groups, stating that it fails to meet international standards and, I quote, leaves the door open for future abuses. Torture. Torture by the Sri Lankan military and police is widespread, especially in the Tamil North and the East. This has been well documented by the International Truth and Justice Project, administered by the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, Yasmin Suka. Unstopped 2016-17 Torture in Sri Lanka, July 2017, is one of several publications from the South African group. The site has detailed account of Joseph Camp. This is the Joint Operation Security Forces Headquarters, JOSFH, in the middle of Avaniya town, in the middle of the north. It is the main torture center in the Tamil areas. Torture rooms and equipment can clearly be seen. There are more than 40 other torture sites in Sri Lanka run by the police and army, and include the notorious CID torture site in Colombo, the dreaded fourth floor where torture has been well documented. Asian Human Rights Commission put this well, I quote, torture is part of the day-to-day operations of the Sri Lankan state. Therefore, it is no exaggeration to say that Sri Lanka is a torture republic. Weapons of mass destruction. We will have to know where the K-4 jets, the massive bombers, the multi-barrel rocket launchers and the helicopter the gunships are stored, and who is in charge of them. The Sri Lankan president can run, but he cannot hide, nor can he hide the weapons of mass destruction. Turning to national reconciliation, I have published a detailed paper which is on the net, and it's titled, Why National Reconciliation in Sri Lanka is Not Possible. The government, past or present, has no interest in national reconciliation, a term used to bluff the international community. Genocide of the Tamil people. I have dealt with this in detail in an article which is on the net. It is not only physical genocide, but cultural, linguistic, religious, economic, and structural genocide. All of these terms have been defined and justified in my article. The need to establish a valid legal and justice system in the north and east. Court cases, especially where the accused is a member of the armed forces or police in the north and east, are being transferred to the Sri Lankan south. This makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the victim and witnesses, Tamils, to go to the new location which is miles away and where the proceedings could well be in Sinhala, a language they do not understand. As a result, the case is usually dropped and the culprit gets away with no conviction. This is unacceptable. Court cases that have come up for hearing in the north and the east must be heard in courts in that area. Turning to courts in Jaffna, the chaos in Jaffna. It is not widely appreciated by the outside world that the social situation in Jaffna is chaotic. Drugs and alcohol. Drugs are brought by the Navy from Kerala in South India and sold in Jaffna. Illicit drugs are freely available and sold to even some as young as 11 years. The illicit use of drugs has increased the crime rate massively. Drug users commit murder, rape, and all sorts of crimes. Drug dealers are openly selling drugs. They are also being sold in villages, creating huge issues for the community. There is also only one hospital that offers alcohol and drug rehab services. This clearly needs to be more drug and rehab services. Without them, they cause many social issues in society. Domestic violence. There has been a marked increase in domestic violence after the end of the armed conflict. Alcohol, husband being unemployed and not earning enough money, the husband believing that his wife is having an affair, which is largely untrue, are some of the causes. Women tolerate this violence for the sake of the children and do not want to lose the respect of their communities. Women rarely report these cases to the police for fear that no action will be taken. When the situation becomes critical, they cannot bear the physical violence anymore. They help the CCOP, a non-government organization, but these are too few and poorly resourced. The Sinhalese police. The police are 95% Sinhalese and do not know Tamil. The language problem means that many cases go unreported, and if a case is reported, the process may be long drawn and often ineffective. Often the police tell people to come back because they do not have a translator. The message finally gets through that it is an exercise in futility. Corrupt police and armed forces. The police and armed forces are corrupt. The Sri Lankan police are reported to be the most corrupt in the world. The police, army and navy are involved with the drug problem plaguing Jaffna. As such, they cannot be trustworthy, particularly if the criminal act is drug-related or involves the armed forces and police. Some of this is dealt with in my book on sexual violence. Counseling in short supply. There are only one or two NGOs offering counseling in villages. As a result, family problems related to abuse of women, abuse of children and domestic violence are not addressed. As a result, serious mental problems such as depression and post-traumatic stress disorder are not addressed. Not surprisingly, suicide rates are high. Professor Somasundaram, professor of psychiatry in Jaffna, stated that the suicide rate in Jaffna is high and rising. Cultural issues. People in the northern province, particularly in Jaffna, have always been hardworking and disciplined. This is no longer the case. During the war, the northern province was cut off from the rest of the country economically and socially. After the war ended, previously unobtainable things previously unobtainable became freely available. So was money, especially from abroad. From having access to nothing, people had access to almost everything. People did not know how to handle this. Whereas earlier, people only bought essentials, they can now buy anything such as smartphones, which allow access to pornography, which has contributed to sexual violence. As mentioned earlier, education in Jaffna has suffered seriously. Adults repeatedly say that children lack motivation to study and expect parents to buy things which they could not afford to do. This has resulted in serious family problems. The caste system, which was virtually stamped out by the Tamil Tigers, has returned. This is particularly so in Jaffna. Many of the low caste people are poor. Some of the children are in need of tuition. They do not have the money to pay for tuition. Women-headed families. Of the 69,000 women-headed families in the north and northern province, 34,000 are in Jaffna. A great deal of money is wasted by the government building houses that are of little use. If this money was given to the families, they could build larger and more useful homes for far less money. Many of these women do hard labor to support their families. Some of their children also work from an early age to support the family. Children having to work have an adverse effect on schoolwork. The Sixth Amendment to the Constitution. The Sixth Amendment to the Constitution must be scrapped. Introduced in August 1983 by Sri Lanka's first dictator, J.R. Jayawardena, the Sixth Amendment states, and I quote, "No person shall directly or indirectly in or outside Sri Lanka support, espouse, promote, finance, encourage or advocate the establishment of a separate state within the territory of Sri Lanka. In other words, one cannot even discuss a separate state for the Tamils. The penalty for violating this constitutional amendment is severe. It includes confiscation of movable or immovable property. While those outside Sri Lanka do not need to worry about this nonsense, those in Sri Lanka do have to worry because the full force of the law will be applied. It might even be applied to those outside Sri Lanka who have property in Sri Lanka. It is imperative that this absurd constitutional amendment be removed. Getting on to a referendum is an important section. It is important to have a referendum in the north and the east to ask the people what they want. Are they happy with what is going on, or do they want a separate state, Tamil? It has to be a proper referendum. A poorly conducted referendum would be more dangerous than no referendum. It has to be a UN-conducted referendum with the UN forces representing the Sri Lankan armed forces, as was done in East Timor. If the results are we want a separate state, then the UN will have to deliver it as was done in East Timor. The more I think about this, the less I'm convinced that a referendum will ever take place. For an effective referendum to take place in the north and the east, the Sri Lankan government will have to cooperate. I cannot see any Sri Lankan government, now or in the future, conducting a proper referendum as I have just set out. The only way an effective referendum will take place is if there is a massive pressure from other countries. The only country that might do so is India, or to be more specific, Tamil Nadu. However, India is run from Delhi, not from Tamil Nadu. As such, hoping that India will act is a futile thought. Tamils without a leader. After the death of S.J.V. Chevanagam, there has been no effective, no Tamil civilian leader worth talking about. The TNA is a joke, and the Sri Lankan government treats it as such. The TNA spokesman is effectively supporting the government of Sri Lanka, not the Tamil people who elected him. For several years, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Mannar, Right Reverend Dr. Rayapu Joseph, was the unofficial leader of the Tamil people. I was worried about his survival and wrote an entire booklet, Sri Lanka, Right Reverend Rayapu Joseph and Others in Danger. He had a devastating stroke and is unable to talk. Whether this is due to medical causes or whether he was poisoned, I do not know. What I do know is that the Tamils have lost an invaluable leader. Who their leader is something that the Tamil people on the ground will have to sort out. It is not something that I should get involved in. The potential for development of the north and the east. There are several economists who have said that Sri Lanka, north and east, have the greatest potential for development. It is this that has been taken over by the armed forces to run commercial projects. The Sinhalese armed forces in the north own a 180-acre farm, many hotels and resorts, a golf course, 3 cricket stadiums, a ferry service, 2 whale watching tours, 2 airlines, and numerous cafes that dot the roads in the north and the east. These are just the ones that we know about. Some of these can be seen in the outstanding publication by the British Tamils Forum, which I have referred to. The land for all this has been seized from the Tamil people without compensation. The economy in crisis. This is the sort of good news for us. Inheriting large budget deficits and dangerously high debts, the Sri Lankan government has been unable to deliver election promises of jobs and improve standards of living. Sri Lanka's debt has risen from 120 billion in 1981 to 10,500 billion in November 2016. Export earnings have declined and there has been a collapse of the state's economy from 23% of GDP in 1996 to 11.3% in 2014. There has been a sharp fall in Sri Lankan production, widening the inequality of income distribution. Nimal Senewiratne from Perdana University, or Perdania, he may be from the agricultural faculty, has recently written an outstanding analysis of the Sri Lankan financial crisis. This being so, the answer to the problems in Sri Lanka is to block financial assistance or aid coming to Sri Lanka from the IMF or whoever or elsewhere, or state that aid will come provided that there is a marked improvement in human rights. This is what the expatriate Tamil community and others concerned with human rights in Sri Lanka should be doing. The Chinese will, of course, not cooperate. As much money as Sri Lanka wants will be supplied by China, as it was when Rajapaksa was last in power. This is money that Sri Lanka can never repay. The land will be sold to China, as has happened in the south. More will be sold this time, and Sri Lanka will become a Chinese colony, one of China's string of pearls. Given this economic crisis, a well-planned economic boycott of goods and services going in and out of Sri Lanka till the Tamil people get their rights is very important. The responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect is a global political commitment which was endorsed by all the members of the UN in the 2005 World Summit to prevent genocide, crimes against humanity, and crimes and war crimes. R2P is based on the premise that sovereignty is a responsibility to protect all its populations from mass atrocities and human rights violations. It is based on a respect for the norms and international law relating to sovereignty, peace, security, and human rights and armed conflict. Clearly, it is applicable to the north and the east of Sri Lanka, where the Tamil people are in need of protection. Anne-Marie Slaughter from Princeton University called R2P the most important shift in our conception of sovereignty since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Louis Arbor from the International Crisis Group said that, I quote, "The responsibility to protect is the most important and imaginative doctrine to emerge on the international scene for decades." Professor Damien Kingsbury from Deacon's University in Australia has written an entire book, Sri Lanka and the Responsibility to Protect, Politics, Ethnicity and Genocide. I will leave it to the lawyers to decide where we go from here. As for me, I will not be surprised if the responsibility to protect is just 3 words with no meaning. Politically active Buddhist monks. Politically active Buddhist monks have been the curse in Sri Lanka for decades. It was one of them who assassinated SWRD Bandaranaike, the first political assassination in Sri Lanka. Somarama Thero, who shot the Prime Minister, was convicted of murder and hanged. Buddharakita Thero, who was the mastermind behind the assassination, was also convicted of murder and sentenced to death. He was reprieved and sentenced to life imprisonment. The power of these monks is enormous. Buddharakita Thero, a whiskey-drinking monk, saw to it that Bandaranaike appointed his mistress, Vimala Vijayawardena, as a minister. I know all this because Bandaranaike was a close relative of mine, and he told me all this. These Buddhist monks have blocked every attempt by every Sri Lankan government to devolve any power to the Tamils, claiming that it was a sellout of a singular Buddhist country to the Tamils. They are now growing even more violent. The Bodu Bala Sena, Buddhist power force, led by a very violent man in yellow robes, who should have been arrested for threatening the police and even the ministers in the government, remains at large. On the 6th of March 2018, President Sirisena declared a state of emergency after violent Buddhist monks attacked Muslim temples, homes and businesses in Kandy. This type of anti-Muslim violence is by extremist Buddhist monks will continue. With some 20,000 Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka, the possibility of an acceptable solution to the problem facing the Tamil people is not good. Returning the land to civilian owners, continuing land grabs. Under the previous Rajapaksa government, 70,000 acres of land were under military occupation. Only 2,000, that's 3.5%, has been released by the Sri Lanka government. This is only 3.5% of the total and land occupancy by the military. What is being released is usually infertile land. Fertile land is being acquired even today, which is 2021. Tamil people are unable to exist since agriculture and fishing are not possible. These land grabs and signalization, which I will deal with, will permanently change the democracy of the Tamil homelands and make the Tamil people destitute in their own homeland. The return of land to civilians is mandatory and urgent. Unless the international community, especially the donor community, exerts the necessary pressure, this will not happen. The Pearl publication I have already referred to has important points about the return of lands to the Tamil people and the recent acquisitions. It says that although the government made a handful of land releases in 2015, 15 and 16, land grabs continue. Statements made by the military confirmed that the Sri Lankan security presence would not change in the north and the east, and that despite the government's commitments that lands in the north and the east will be returned in 2018, the military would, and I quote, would not return even an inch of land to their rightful owners. In November 2017, President Sirisena assured military officers that the government would not release lands needed for national security. In July 17, the government released lands for 50 families in Meladi Harbour, but the returned land was so uninhabitable after 27 years of military occupation. Families had been given inadequate support to support their fishing livelihood. The majority of homes, part of the harbour and the TB hospital remain in the occupied territories as of February 2018. There is also evidence of continuing land grabs, with the Navy giving notice in October 2017 that it acquired 276 acres in Mullaivaikkal and is taking private lands in Cairns. Military facilities continue expanding in the Vani, Kilinochi and Mullaitivu, with new appropriations occurring as recently as March 2018. Harassment of Tamil civilians living in a military police state. The presence of the military in the Tamil areas has a profound impact on Tamil civilian lives. The military and police continue to harass and intimidate Tamils in the north and the east. Civilians who protest, demanding information about the disappeared and the return of their lands, are threatened. Repression extends to those who commemorate Tamils who died during the armed conflict. In 2017, organizers of both Mullaivaikkal and the Maviranal were intimidated. Government agents have targeted Tamil activists for their UN advocacy, harassing their families and intimidated them by taking photographs. The resettlement of Tamil civilians is a farce. 3 years after the election of President Sirisena, only 3,996 people have been resettled. As of October 2017, some 40,900 members of 12,676 families remain initially displaced. Fear and insecurity in the Tamil north and the east. The overwhelming problems facing the people in the north and the east is fear and insecurity. They are justifiably afraid of the armed forces, police, Sinhalese who have settled there and are supported by the armed forces and police. Tamil paramilitaries working with the government and alarmingly fear of each other. No one is confident that what is told to someone might not be conveyed to someone else for monetary gain. Living in insecure homes is another major problem. Armed forces and police can kick the door down if there exists one, and sexually assault those, including children. A photograph of one of such case can be seen in my book on sexual violence. Until that armed forces are removed from the north and the east, this fear and uncertainty will remain. It will not happen unless there is a massive international pressure on the Sri Lankan government. Informers and funds. We must have informers, spies, if you like, on the ground in the Sri Lankan north and east. Can they be found? Yes, they can, but they have to be paid. I have strongly addressed the organization to which I belong, which is the Transnational Government of Tamil, the need to have some funds. Business organizations, especially in Canada, will provide the money if they know where the money is going to be used for. Boycotts. Say no to Sri Lanka, which was operative some time ago will have to be restarted. When I was in South Africa to see Bishop Desmond Tutu, I met several former ANC leaders. They told me that two things that were successful in overthrowing the apartheid regime was boycott of the economy and boycott of sports, especially cricket. These proven methods will have to be used on Sri Lanka to bring the ruling regime to its knees. Support those who work. There is an absolute need to support people like Pearl and Adyalam Center for Policy Research that have produced such outstanding work. To support Pearl and get them to send another team of investigators to Sri Lanka is crucial. Get people of importance to visit the North and the East. Get your Member of Parliament and others in high places to visit the North and the East and speak with the people as Pearl have done. It is important that they take with them people who can speak Tamil and not rely on the Sri Lankan government to provide them. India, or I'll deal with India or rather Delhi, has a crucial role to play which it has not done. This is why I urged the organization with which I work to set up an office, however small, in Delhi and in Tamil Nadu to supply the necessary information about the current situation in Lanka. Such an office, the Tamil Information Centre, existed in London many years ago under Kandaya Kandasamy and was very important in providing information. I visited this centre and was greatly impressed with the work they did. Get involved. It is most important that people get involved. There are some 1.5 million expatriate Tamils in the world, living and working in the most powerful countries in the world. They are by far the most powerful force that the Tamils in the North and the East have got. If instead of fighting with each other or saying Tamils want Tamilism, they focused on the deteriorating human rights situation in the Tamil North and the East, a lot can be achieved. All of us who support the struggle of the Tamil people want Tamilism. However, with rapid singleization of the Tamil North and the East, there might be no Elam. Hence the need for urgent action. To act now, tomorrow might be too late for the Tamils in the North and the East. An overview of human rights in the North and the East. It is time to look at the human rights situation of the people in the North and the East and ask the question, looking at the human rights of the people in the North and the East, are they better off now or were they better off 15 years ago? The answer is worrying. It is no, they are worse off, probably much worse off. If that's the case, it is time to think the entire issue and to act to address the problem. Launching a worldwide action program. A worldwide action program will have to be launched right now to monitor the human rights situation in the Tamil North and the East and periodically report back to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in view of a conviction of an accelerated deterioration in civic rights, political, minority, religious and other democratic rights and call for international action. It is very clear that the expatriate Tamils, now 1.5 million, and others concerned with what is going on in Sri Lanka will have to do. Can anything be done? In summary, something will have to be done to save Sri Lanka in general and the Tamils in particular. In Sri Lanka, there have been massive protests. I'm not going to go into in detail, but there have been at least 4 massive protests in Jaffna and in Batticaloa to grind the area to a halt. Outside Sri Lanka, with 1.5 million Tamils living in all the important countries in the world, these expatriate Tamils are the strongest force that those in Sri Lanka and the East have got. Unfortunately, this massive force is divided for petty reasons, and more recently they have become apathetic and have not appreciated the gravity of the situation facing the Tamil people. Here is something that they can do. One, get the message to the world that what is going on in the North and the East, especially the fact that the military, the area is a military/police state. Secondly, that people cannot exist if their lands are taken over and their occupation, which is agriculture and fishing, are prevented. Thirdly, the Tamil people in this area do not live, they merely exist. Even that is becoming increasingly difficult. Jaffna is awash with drugs and alcohol brought by the Sri Lankan Navy from India. Those who disbelieve this must go to Jaffna and talk to the people. Go there and live to go there and live in a 5-star hotel or with family and then say that all is well with Jaffna is nonsense, in addition to being untrue. Torture is taking place in at least 40 cities, mainly police stations and army camps. The Joseph camp in the middle of Vavuniya, which I have referred to, and the CID 4th floor must be visited even if they are told that they are not tourist attractions. Do what they have done in apartheid South Africa, which is to isolate Sri Lanka. Say no to Sri Lanka is worth supporting. Goods and services in and out of Sri Lanka, especially tourists, must stop. There are many places with golden beaches and sea, such as Bali in Indonesia and Phuket in Thailand, where the beaches are not blood-stained. This publication and the dozen DVDs I have recorded on the Tamil struggle must be distributed. The fact that unless the international community, especially the aid community, the Tamils, unless they act, the Tamils will cease to be a people. This is genocide. The best way to find out what is going on in Sri Lanka is to get your MP and others in positions of power to go there and see what is happening. Time is crucial. You must go now. Tomorrow may be too late for the Tamils. If you cannot go to Sri Lanka, let Sri Lanka, that is asylum seekers, come to you. Listen to what they have to tell you. They know full well the ground situation in the Tamil areas. Check the outstanding publications of Yasmin Suka in South Africa. Read what the international human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and the International Commission Group publish. More important than all of these, get involved. The future of the entire nation, the Tamil nation of Sri Lanka, is at stake. Before I close, I will like to suggest a few topics for future meetings. Genocide in Sri Lanka. Secondly, what the singular majority must know. Thirdly, the British Commonwealth responsibility. British and Commonwealth responsibility. Why national reconciliation is not possible in Sri Lanka. Setting up information centers to counter disinformation, lies, damn lies, and the Sri Lankan government. The future of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. I will now leave it open for questions.